The Atlantic slave trade's effect on Africa. The Atlantic slave trade tore apart African communities and waged internal wars. This left Africa vulnerable to European conquest and exploitation, leaving economic hardship in their wake. The Atlantic slave trade radically impaired Africa to this day. In order to understand how the Atlantic slave trade affected Africa, we need to look at the beginning. In 1492, with the first arrival of Christopher Columbus and the Spanish conquest of the East Indies, came the first exploitation of the New World. With so much land to cultivate, they needed laborers. Although they brought white indentured servants and utilized native labor, it wasn't enough, especially since many natives were sick and dying due to diseases like smallpox. The Europeans were looking for a way to solve this labor issue. They knew Africa was in need of manufactured goods, and that they shared a similar climate to that of the New World, so they were seen as a very suitable candidate. The Muslim slave trade in Africa had endured for centuries, which further inspired the Spanish. The Europeans came bearing arms in exchange for slave labor. Since the slaves were prisoners of war to the nations the Europeans were trading with, it was a simple decision made by the rulers. They wanted to get rid of them. With the ammunition, these kingdoms were made stronger. This pushed neighboring rivals to sell slaves as well, as their nations would fall if they didn't. While not every nation participated, those who didn't eventually collapsed. This subsequently created an arms race, which increased disputes in Africa. African leaders needed slaves to get more arms, so they would go to slave wars in order to capture the people of other lands and sell them into slavery. This made certain nations very wealthy and others poverty-stricken. Slavery radically changed the economy. The cycle of exploiting others for money entrenched itself into the aristocracies of Africa. They got money for getting rid of criminals, which promoted lawlessness and corrupt governments for the future. While I won't get into these governments too much, just know there was an overwhelming amount of embezzlement. At this time in history, the size of a nation's economy was directly related to the amount of people living there. They sold off close to 10 million Africans, which would have radically impaired many African economies, leaving them underdeveloped. With 10 million able-bodied men taken from the continent, there were a few other lasting issues. Since few women were taken, there was a huge shift in demographics. This led to female dominance and reproduction issues. Women got used to having many children in order to regain population balance, and war was also difficult to fight because the nations had a surplus of women and children and a lack of men. Since men were taken as tribute and enslaved, there were few groups of female warriors. Take the Dahomey Amazons, for example. In the early 19th century, when buying new slaves was officially abolished, the African economies dependent on the slave trade crashed. This left many nations poor and weak, perfect for exploitation and colonization. Actually, the halt of the slave trade was so detrimental to African societies. Kings like Bani from Nigeria literally begged the Europeans to continue enslavement. In the 1870s, Britain gained the ability to transport large amounts of heavy materials across oceans. This gave them the ability to transport raw materials from Africa. While colonization efforts in Africa had begun much before the 1870s, this new ability was the main factor in Britain's overwhelming presence in Africa. European countries began colonizing Africa in hopes of taking the resources. This made it incredibly difficult for Africans to start their own economies. In 1884, the Berlin Conference sealed Africa's fate. The Europeans divided Africa amongst themselves, with little regard for the demographics living there. Many of these nations spoke vastly different languages and had different religions and overall cultures. Not only that, but a few years prior, many were warring amongst themselves. This created intense political turmoil, especially since effective communication was near impossible with so many languages. Since the Europeans were only interested in goods and not the people, They were oppressed, and poverty within these countries only increased. Take the Congo Free State, for example. In 1885, King Leopold II gained ownership of the Congo. He was known for the brutal treatment of the Congolese. He forced them into labor, and if they didn't fill their quotas, they were lashed and beaten. Another punishment used by the force publique was the amputation of hands. This extended to women and children as well. Anyone who didn't fulfill the rubber quota was subject to punishment. Many people called this the scramble for Africa. While it may appear that way on a map, it was more of a scramble to sign treaties. In order to gain rule of the area, they had to show power over the land. Most of these European powers already held stake in their eventual nations, but they were scrambling to sign documents before the other nations could take their land from them. Most of these European outposts were coastal, because they were established as ports as a pit stop to India. There were few colonization attempts on the African interior, so that is where much of the land grabbing takes place. Colonial rule also led to political isolation. There was a lack of infrastructure within Africa. These countries could only communicate with their colonizers. Togo was remote to Benin and Ghana, which border each other, but was just a call away from Paris, hundreds of miles away. Since coordination with the Africans was difficult, and they were largely malnourished due to poverty, everything was left up to the Europeans. Africans lost the vital skill to compete with other nations, which left them underdeveloped with no way to fix it. Many of the modern ideas in economy were embedded into cultures by this time, but Africa never developed this competitive mindset, which is another factor in why many African economies of today are still suffering. Coupling this non-competitive spirit with the oppression from colonizers and corrupt government was a true trifecta into stagnation. It's not that these economies declined, rather that they grew outdated and were unable to adapt to the rapidly expanding markets of their competitors. There were also many tariffs and trade restrictions on African goods, marking the turn of the century. The poverty in the area made it impossible to sell things amongst themselves, and cheaper high-quality goods were being produced elsewhere. While many economies of today are much better than they were of that time, comparatively, not much has changed. African economies are rapidly growing, but most of them are still riddled with poverty, corruption, and danger. These African nations were some of the last to gain their independence, only occurring in the mid to late 20th century. Societally, most of the changes occurred at the beginning of colonial rule, when differing cultures were forced to share boundaries. The employment of policies like assimilation and direct rule led to the loss of culture and identity, and again at the end when mass uprisings occurred, leading to political autonomy of almost every African nation in the span of 10 years. Slavery was a catalyst for a long progression of suffering, for the people involved, but also for the continent as a whole. It has been close to 500 years since the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, and Africa has still not entirely recuperated. Every limb was torn from Africa, and it was left to stand on its own.